Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Peter Schwartzstein, an environmental journalist who reports on water, food security, and the conflict-climate nexus in about 30 countries, mainly in the Middle East and Africa. Together, we discuss his new book, called The Heat and the Fury on the Frontlines of Climate Violence, as well as the outlook for climate adaptation in the Middle East and the ways in which environmental initiatives can build peace in the region. Then Leah Hickert continues the conversation with Will Todman and Natasha to discuss how international donors and local civil society groups help Middle Eastern governments adapt to climate change. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Peter Schwartzstein, welcome to Babel.
Thank you very much for having me back on.
One of the themes of your book is that climate exacerbates bad governance. People have talked about how climate causes conflict. People have talked about climate exacerbates conflict. What do you mean by climate exacerbates bad governance?
I think of climate as amplifying whatever a society's existing fissures or existing weaknesses are. So when you have a place that is suffering from varying degrees of state mismanagement, then the very fact that climate change is reducing that already not very well-governed state's capacity to deliver various services such as fresh water, sufficient sewage disposal, affordable food, just ensures that they're even less capable of providing those services than they previously were.
There are a number of scholars who've been looking at the nexus between climate and conflict. You've read all their books. What do you think they're either getting wrong or need to focus on that they're not focusing on?
I'm always wary of bricking on my peers, given that so much of what I've done owes a tremendous debt to the work that's come before me. But I perhaps have also a sort of journalist's slight prejudice against the manner in which some scholars and academics go about their work, that there's too much focus on the minutiae of a subject and insufficient focus on the bigger picture. So take the conflict in Syria. From about 2013, there was an enormous amount of coverage of the supposed extent to which climate change contributed to the beginnings of the revolution that then led into the civil war. And then that in turn led to this enormous backlash from various scholars who insisted, with a degree of reason, but only a degree of reason, that many sensationalist parts of media had massively overstated the influence of climate change. And that's all true. But as is so often the case, there's a very real middle ground in which the research and groundwork that I've done over many years in Syria and that of many of my peers have done shows that climate change was very much a factor, just not the be-all and end-all that slightly shoddy articles at one point or other suggested.
And you had examples of the government adulterating fertilizer, which would have been a problem in an earlier time, but in the face of climate change becomes catastrophic.
Absolutely. I mean, I've tried to steer clear of Syria just because of the extent to which that did monopolize coverage of the conflict climate space. But I lead with it because it's unavoidable, in large part because I wanted to provide an example as to one of the ways in which climate change did actually play a part. And as you alluded to, for many years in the run-up to 2011, farmers in the northeast of Syria in particular, which was much the most agrarian part of the country, had to put up with the same volumes of corruption from these kickback-seeking officials as their peers elsewhere in the country. But as that drought intensified and continued through the years in the run-up to 2011, these farmers' willingness and ability to put up with those bribe-seeking demands decreased. I mean, at a time when your harvests were failing, your crop yields were shrinking, the very fact that officials were coming back demanding the same sums of cash that you were now even less capable of providing, and were hampering you with these worse quality seeds and even worse quality fertilizers at a time of your greatest need, meant that the degree of rage at that corruption was that bit higher. So when I try and look at how climate change contributes to other drivers of instability, such as corruption, such as inequality, that's really what I'm driving at.
We first spoke on Babel 5 years ago. What's changed between the conversation we had 5 years ago and what you're seeing on the ground now?
I guess I'll give you sort of one way in which things have got worse and one in which they've got better. Worse in that the general environment and climate prognosis in the Middle East has only worsened over the past few years. This is a region which has roughly 6% of the world's population and about 1.5% of its freshwater resources. And the mismatch between available supply and demand is only widening. And at the same time, of course, quality of governance has, by and large, only worsened across the board, ensuring that the impact of those worsening and intensifying climate stresses is felt that bit more profoundly. So that's the worst. Things are, on that count, becoming more debilitating almost by the year. The good is, as you might have seen over the past year or two in particular, there has been this rash of transboundary water, environment, climate initiatives across the region, particularly in the Gulf. Now, many of these are purely rhetorical. They're not really meant to get off the ground. And some of them are opportunistic initiatives that maybe sound good, but ultimately also stand little prospect of generating meaningful change. But the very fact that we're seeing more and more of these initiatives, to my mind, is a massive net positive, even if most of them lead to very little in the way of actual concrete action. And that's because a lot of the time you're just having interaction between different parts of government that wouldn't otherwise happen. That's almost always a net positive. And then equally, this does seem to be an illustration of the fact that some of these countries, with their often complicated, put it lightly, relations with one another, really are seeking to at least partly divorce climate and water and environment from their wider relationships. There is an understanding that this can't really be a zero-sum issue and that this really can and should be at least partly disconnected from the wider dynamic.
You've spoken to more people in more places about climate and conflict than anybody I've come across in this field. What do you see as the most important similarities going across regions and countries? What are some of the important differences? And is there any difference that you see between the Middle East context and the South Asian context that your book also explores?
One of the key points of similarity is that it's at a very local level, between communities, between villages, and between various subnational actors like provinces and, say, governorates in an Iraqi context, where resource-related violence is really mushrooming. And that's true of the Middle East, and that's true of parts of Africa and South Asia as well. Now, we know that at a global level, there are more conflicts within countries than at any point since the Second World War. And a lot of the time, that's because there is sort of more incentive to violence at a local level than there is between nation states, where a lot of the time countries are aware that there's limited prospect of actually pilfering additional resources from one's neighbor, while unfortunately it's often a rather different situation at a local level. So that's a key similarity. Points of difference, I'd have to rack my brain here. But for me, someone who's done most of his work in different parts of the Middle East and North and East Africa, the captivating thing is the sort of relative absence of water. In South Asia, a lot of the time it's an issue of excess water, but also the degree of variation in South Asia is extra problematic. The monsoon has sometimes been described only half jocularly as the real finance minister of South Asia. And the very fact that the Indias and Pakistans and Bangladeshs of the world are as acutely vulnerable to this increasingly fickle series of seasonal rains arguably places them at an even greater risk than many of their Middle Eastern peers who don't have enough water but aren't necessarily suffering with quite the same degree of seasonal variations as their peers elsewhere.
Does that suggest that in South Asia, more of the emphasis should be placed on large-scale infrastructure, and in the Middle East, more on community-based or locally based initiatives to distribute scarce water, or are there other conclusions we should draw from that?
It varies a lot through different parts of South Asia and different parts of the Middle East. Really, we need everything. We need a return in some instances to the kinds of nature-based or indigenous solutions that are sometimes excessively fetishized, but nevertheless play their role. I'm talking here of things like the Karez systems that we've historically had in parts of Iran, parts of northern Iraq, the Faraj system in Oman and parts of the Arabian Peninsula. They can play a role to a certain extent. Equally, there are places, especially in the Saudis and other parts of the Middle East, in which enhanced and ever more efficient desalination is unfortunately likely the only solution, despite the many potential pitfalls. And then in parts of South Asia, parts of the Middle East, parts of Africa alike, there's going to be some really, really tough policy levers that states have to pull. And by this, I mean there are places in which agriculture is no longer viable, no matter what kinds of infrastructure is built, no matter what kinds of support is offered to farmers. Now, from a psychological point of view, that's extremely difficult. There's a desire to at least have partial mastery over your food supplies in places in which denial of food access or rising food prices has often been fatal for regimes. But you have places in which the nature of climate stresses mixed in with the nature of environmental degradation ensures that farming just isn't viable. And the understandable unwillingness on the part of authorities in parts of Jordan and parts of Iraq to recognize that will unfortunately stand these places in ever poorer stead as we go on.
The Rutgers historian Toby Jones, writing about Saudi Arabia in the 1970s, talked about how the Saudis had turned oil into water, that they had used the oil resources to dig into aquifers and make Saudi Arabia one of the world's largest wheat producers for a while. I was surprised that aquifers didn't play a larger role in your book. Aquifers, as you know, have been very important to agriculture in a number of arid places. Aquifers are a little bit harder because you can't see them. You don't really know that they're shrinking, although certainly the water table in places like Yemen is dropping precipitously. How do you see aquifers as a piece of this, and why were they not a focus of what you wrote about?
I mean, up to a point, it's partly a function of where I've kind of centered much of my work. So the Arabian Peninsula per se has not been as significant an area of research for me as it has for many others. But in the places where I have done much of my work, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, part of the issue is that we just don't have anywhere near as much data as we need. Now, this is a classic recurring problem across the region in which either data straight up doesn't exist or it's not made widely available by authorities. But, I mean, people often look at aquifers, especially farmers and municipal water authorities, as some kind of magical alternative source of water that can be turned to at a time when the rains are not falling as they previously did. And this is a massive issue because we have a wealth of anecdotal evidence, if not stats per se, to show that groundwater levels are falling at a pace that simply can't be sustained for much longer. So take Jordan, a country which is more groundwater dependent than almost any other in the region. Something like 10 out of the country's 12 main non-renewable aquifers are being pumped more or less dry. And as of a few years ago, Amman and the populous cities to its north are mostly dependent on the Dizi aquifer near the Saudi border. Now, when that aquifer runs dry, because it too is a non-renewable one, at some point in the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years maximum, nobody really knows what's going to come next, where the authorities are going to turn to for that kind of irreplaceable source of current supply. So this is a real kind of watch this space type issue.
Certainly one of the things that we're seeing people talk about around the world is the energy transition, a shift toward renewables, as that certainly is not going to end a lot of the disruptions we see because of climate change. But it also seems that the energy transition can have its own disruptions in many states. As you think about your experience throughout the Middle East, what kinds of disruptions do you expect to see because of the energy transition and a shift toward renewables?
I, like you, go to some of the same conferences across the region, and I sometimes walk away shaking my head, thinking that so many folks here, including these extremely clever, very switched on people, are just sort of walking into the abyss. And that abyss is a world with a good deal less fossil fuel usage, which, I mean, for some of the reasons we've touched on, is absolutely vital. But for countries like Iraq, countries like Libya that derive over 90% of their state revenues from oil and gas, there is next to no conversation on anything like the scale necessary as to what comes when the lifeblood of those economies slowly dissipates. I mean, the EU forecasts that by 2050, it will have something like a 79% reduction in its consumption of oil and gas. And if anything like that alone comes true, then that's just punching a kind of yawning gap in the balance sheets of basically every petrostate in the region. I mean, I've talked to an array of sort of Iraqi senior policymakers in particular, from the former president and the former prime minister downwards, and they still talk about this as if it's some sort of hypothetical, vague future threat, rather than something which will come their way, even if we don't move away from oil and gas at the speed that is necessary, or perhaps even at the full extent that is necessary. This is a speeding bullet heading the way of so many of the regional regimes, and so few of them seem to be making anything like the adequate preparation.
You and I have also spent a lot of time in Egypt. How do you think this is going to unfold in a place like Egypt, which has a lot of infrastructure, which has a lot of people who need transportation, cooling? How does this play out there?
On balance, I fear not well. Now, Egypt, in theory, has quite a lot going for it. In this perspective, it's got a large chunk of what's known as the solar belt, this kind of swathe of reliably sunny territory in the far south where one could generate not only enough energy to supply Egypt's own needs, but arguably and quite possibly that of a chunk of Europe as well.
Is it really of the scale where they could meet all of their electricity needs domestically as well as export?
In theory, yes. It's just a question of whether they could get anything like the startup capital needed to build sufficient solar facilities. And I mean, of course, there's also that issue of needing the storage capacity to hold themselves over during the nighttime hours and during those rarish windows when the sun doesn't shine. But all of this requires quality governance. It requires anything but the kind of relatively chronic short-termist thinking that we've seen out of Cairo and so many other capitals. So even among states like Egypt that do have some of the tools to begin making this transition, we're just not seeing the degree of management necessary.
Well, and profound amounts of capital. Jordan has been very interested in building its solar capacity.
And it's a relative success.
And the U.S. has been investing in that, trying to wean Iraq off of Iranian energy by having Jordanian exports. It still seems like it is relatively small scale and slow in a place that is 10% the size of Egypt and relatively better governed.
I mean, when it comes to renewables, Jordan is sort of more than a relative success story. I think it's gone from something like having 10 to 12% of its electricity needs met by renewables, more than tripling that in the past decade. Given the fact that these solar panels and other associated bits of infrastructure keep on absolutely plummeting in cost, there's plenty of reason to envisage them making significantly greater gains in the years ahead. In climate discourse, this is one of the massive sources of optimism at a time when a lot else is not going right. The economic competitiveness of renewables is extraordinary. I mean, at this point, not just matching, but in some places, massively outpacing oil and gas. And for places like Egypt and Jordan and further afield, where sort of it's cost and almost cost alone that's the key driving factor, that's really important and good news.
What about the costs of moving away from all the infrastructure that is built around fossil fuels and electrifying everything into a sophisticated grid? I mean, is there money to do that in places like Egypt, Jordan, Iraq?
In Egypt and Jordan, I don't think so. And it would require not only a lot in the way of international assistance, but also the kinds of private sector investment that we don't yet seem to be seeing. In the Gulf, and also in theory in Iraq, during periods when oil prices are perhaps a little bit higher than they currently are, there are some of the sums of money necessary to begin making that happen. But I mean, I used to get asked a fair bit by Western diplomats in Baghdad, like, what would it take for Iraq to begin addressing its water issues and treating them with the appropriate seriousness? And I used to say with relative conviction, it will take just a massive crisis, and at that point, they'll have to act whether they want to or not. And then along came the 2018 super drought, 120,000 odd people hospitalized for waterborne illnesses in the Basra area, and still, some little quick fixes aside, the Iraqi state did very little. So perhaps my confidence that crises will begin to shake states out of their torpor has been quite seriously shaken.
And certainly what we've seen in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, rather than relying on solar, there's been an investment in nuclear power. I guess from the assessment that even though that's a multi-billion-dollar decade-long operation to get going, it's still a better bet than large-scale solar.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an energy expert. I'm going to move a little beyond here to add the concentration of key resources in either the form of desalination facilities or the form of nuclear facilities is a dangerous and possibly messy phenomenon in a region where, for example, the Houthis have attacked some of Saudi's desalination facilities, thereby massively reducing the volume of fresh water that the Saudi state was able to provide for its citizens for a period. We've had similar-ish things playing out with some of Israel's desalination facilities over the years. So arguably in a region which doesn't look like it's going to reach kind of necessary degrees of stability and peacefulness anytime soon. One of the key advantages behind wind and solar and other forms of more dispersed renewables is the ways in which that can be partly insulated from broader chaos.
There's a large theme at the end of your book about environmental peacemaking, environmental peace building, the role that environment can and should play in healing some of the divisions in the region. A lot of the examples you have are international ones, especially around Arab-Israeli issues. What are the unexploited opportunities to do environmental peacemaking domestically, and why haven't more of them been exploited?
From a Middle Eastern context, this peace-building idea, this environmental peace-building idea has a lot of attractions, and I would also argue a lot of potential. And as I alluded to with this kind of raft of kind of transboundary initiatives in the environment, climate, water space, I think there is a recognition among authorities in the Gulf and perhaps elsewhere that you can kind of kill two birds with one stone. You can achieve slightly superior environmental outcomes while also, in some ways at least, reducing the prospects of conflict. Now, even in a Tigris-Euphrates basin sense, there's been a lot of mostly behind-the-scenes water-related negotiations over the years. I'm only privy to sort of small bits of it. But there's an argument to be made that even though to look now at a time when the Lower Zab, one of the Tigris's key tributaries, more or less ran dry last week, doesn't look like much of a success story, but the absence of additional tensions, the absence of forms of violence that might otherwise have existed, can be a success story in relative terms. So there's a lot of utility to be had here.
Is there an international edge in helping domestic efforts at environmental peace building? Why should international actors be concerned with domestic environmental peace building?
I think, as we perhaps ought to have learnt over the years, problems in one place don't remain nice little self-contained messes. I mean, this is one of the key arguments to be made for aiding climate action elsewhere. You don't necessarily have to do it for the sake of justice, but you should do it because it's in your own self-interest. So when it comes to tackling climate stresses at large in the Middle East, in Africa, in poorer parts elsewhere in the world, or when it comes to sort of, helping to resolve or at least in some way mitigate these environment or non-environment related domestic disputes, it's in our interests because the ways in which those can bleed into issues that we do deeply care about, from migration through to radicalization, through the rise of various non-state groups, which, as I basically cover in the first chapter of the book, kind of thrive in these ungoverned, climate-battered vacuums. I spent the best part of 3 years looking at how ISIS in rural parts of Iraq and Syria profited from collapsing agricultural conditions to bolster its ranks. At no point am I arguing that this is a climate-fueled phenomenon alone, but it would not have been able to secure anything like the number of fighters that it initially did, were it not for the fact that you had this climate-battered rural expanse in which jobs were disappearing at the most extraordinary pace, in which farmers were living off a fraction of the volume of money that they deemed to be viable, and most particularly that they weren't receiving anything like the sorts of support that they felt themselves entitled to. And that just added to an array of other grievances and resentment. And that's a global story. And failed states, as we have learned over the years, are in nobody's interest.
Peter Schwartzstein, thank you very much for joining us once again on Babel.
Thank you very much. I look forward to making it a hat trick a number of years into the future.
Mr. Schwartzstein discussed how environmental degradation and climate change exacerbate bad governance. How can international actors finance climate change mitigation or adaptation in places suffering from bad governance?
So I think firstly, there's a range of contexts that we would group under bad governance. So on one hand, that could be unresponsive politics. It could be, a very corrupt place. It could be a place that's at war, that has no governing authorities, or it could be a place that's controlled by a non-state group, sometimes groups that are designated as terrorist organizations. And so I think the challenges for operating in those different places are very different. Broadly speaking, though, I would say international actors should focus on adaptation rather than mitigation in these places, for exactly the reasons that Peter Schwartzstein said, that bad governance can be exacerbated by climate change. And so I think focusing on the adaptation piece is really important to bolster the resilience of these communities. And so there are ways that humanitarian organizations can mainstream adaptation into the operations they're doing or into early recovery operations as well. We're seeing lots of that at the moment, maybe even too much, or I think it's often not informed by real climate experts or people who fully understand the context there. So I think there's, a danger that it might not be being done as well as it could be done. But looking at other international actors like international financial institutions, they're often really constrained in what they can do in some of these contexts. And for them, I would say one of the most important things is to try to embed mechanisms of social accountability into the finance that they provide. And what that means is that's including a range of different kinds of stakeholders from the community that would benefit from these interventions and from this finance, to gather different perspectives, but also to make sure that there are mechanisms for transparency, because ultimately a lot of elites in these kinds of places have found lots of ways of benefiting in a corrupt way from these kinds of interventions.
And I think it needs to be emphasized what the effects of bad governance could be in times of a natural disaster, because as Peter was talking about, it really exposes the fissures in society. And we've seen that to dramatic effect in places like Bangladesh and in places like Armenia. In 1970, the Bola cyclone was horrific. It killed, hundreds of thousands of people. And the government of Pakistan at the time simply wasn't helping East Pakistan. And that, in addition to a bunch of other issues, led to fighting and later the independence of a new country. In the case of Armenia, an earthquake in 1988 that the Soviet Union simply didn't really effectively respond to was yet another reason for sort of the desire for independence amongst a lot of the states there. So there are serious ramifications. We're about to come out with an edited volume, and one of the case studies is Sana'a, Yemen, which the Houthis now control, a non-state actor. And by some metrics, the Houthis, one of the reasons that they started expanding beyond the mountains that they're traditionally located in is because they started running out of water. And so the big issue today is if international actors are supporting climate adaptation and water security in the internationally recognized government-controlled areas, but they refuse to do anything in Sana'a or in Houthi-controlled areas, what will that really look like in the years to come as Sana'a continues to run out of water? Will you see outward migration from that area and ongoing conflict? Because that's what we've seen, as Peter was mentioning, at lower levels within all of these countries in recent years.
Let's talk about why this matters. What will happen to the region, if not the world, if the Middle East doesn't adapt to climate change and water scarcity?
I mean, like I said, I think the situation is pretty dire. The Middle East today already imports a great majority of its food, and that lack of food sovereignty is quite scary for a lot of governments. And we saw that with the crisis in Ukraine, where Lebanon and Egypt and Yemen imported a lot of their fertilizers and grains from these areas. And so they are very, very vulnerable to any kind of shocks in the system. And so again, you might see countries, and this is what we have seen with countries in the Gulf that have the money to do so, buying up land in other parts of the world, including the United States, to grow things like alfalfa for their own cows, for their own cattle. And we might see that, the sort of that outward grasp for land and water beyond the Middle East. And so there's that aspect of it. I think there's also certainly the migration aspect of it. If you look at maps of the livability of certain areas in the Middle East and Africa, many of these places will not be livable in the future. And so we're already seeing that in parts of southern and central Iraq, where tens of thousands of people have been forced to move to other parts of the country. And so as you see that, you'll see rising tensions within cities as sort of the country folk go to urban areas and put strains on already existing strained basic services. And that's what you've seen in places like Basra.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Natasha said. And I think it's important to think about how unevenly the effects of climate change are probably going to be felt across the region. We talk about parts of the region becoming unlivable, and that's certainly true for many people. There will be some who are able to live in perfectly air-conditioned conditions, And so they will make it livable, but not everyone has the resources to be able to do that. And it's going to take a massive amount of resources. And we've seen some of the ways in which even some of the world's most advanced cities have struggled with the effects of climate change. The flooding in Dubai earlier this year was an example of that. And so I think there are some pieces of this that the richer countries will be able to adapt to and work their way through. But even they will face real challenges. And then if you turn to the middle income countries, the lower middle income countries, the conflict affected countries, this will really make large areas unlivable. It will destroy large swaths of the economy, and it will lead to enormous disruptions.
As Peter was mentioning, there's a lot of government officials that are delaying the necessary reforms. And I think that there are reasons for that. If you go to any of these countries, including look around our own country, there are certain people that are more affected by these issues than others, right? If you go to Amman, Jordan, and you go to a place like Abdoun, a rich sort of neighborhood within Amman, you sometimes see green lawns. People can purchase bottled water. They can afford to live in a scarce environment, whereas others simply get sick or they have less money. And many of these places, a big portion of income is dealt out to, generator owners or to water tankers. It's becoming increasingly expensive to be poor in these countries. And unfortunately, that kind of suffering doesn't typically rise up the ranks to elites that are making policy decisions sometimes.
How can individuals and civil society groups help governments adapt to climate change?
So I have spent some time thinking about this, and a report will be coming out on this topic in a couple of weeks. I think there are lots of ways. You said adapt, and I think that's important again. I think they are much better suited to work on adaptation than on mitigation. So that means rather than trying to advance renewables, it's about trying to build the resilience of communities to be able to survive these climate shocks and the scale of environmental degradation that is already taking place. So in part, I think there are a lot of experts who are able to come up with better solutions for some of these crises, and they can provide governments with those ideas, whether at the local level, at the municipality level, or even at the central government. And I think another way that they can really help, though, is on building community support for some of the changes that are going to have to take place. When we think about the energy transition, we think about the way in which economies will have to deal with fewer electricity or fuel subsidies. But actually, this whole transition to sustainability, which is necessary for the region to remain livable, is going to transform loads of ways in which societies currently function in the region, from the kinds of crops that people grow to how people use water, to even the type of transportation that they take. And so I think civil society groups really do have an awareness building role that is about understanding the priorities of communities and trying to express the necessity of some of these changes in ways that they really understand and can buy into. So when you talk about CO2 emissions or the ozone layer, that doesn't work. But when you talk about jobs and food security and access to water, these things resonate with people's daily priorities. And I think there is a real role there. And then another sort of area in which civil society is really well placed, I think, to act is in collecting data. This is an issue across the region where there is just a real lack of data. And so we can't fully understand the problem. And a lot of groups are working to fill in some of those gaps, whether it is tracking whale movements off the coast of Oman as part of conservation efforts, to tracking water levels in different water resources in Tunisia. And I know, Natasha, you've focused quite a lot on ways that different groups and different actors are collecting water data.
Yeah, civil society and academia in these countries have done some really amazing things in spite of very restrictive circumstances. And I think the key there is allowing civil society to do that, because sometimes data is dangerous for governments. In Jordan, most of the people in Amman now rely on, Peter alluded to it, but it's the Dissi aquifer, which is fossil water in the south that's pumped all the way to Amman. Now, as this gets depleted, the water becomes more radioactive. And so we are seeing rising radioactive levels in the water. obviously the government would not want to promote what's happening there. In parts of northeast Syria, even, the groundwater levels are so depleted that the naturally occurring element of fluoride is reaching toxic levels. And so there is a great need for data collection to really understand these processes, and you need civil society on the ground to do that. We have amazing technology like GRACE satellite monitoring, where we can measure year on year the depletion of groundwater levels, for example, things that we can't see, but we still need those people on the ground collecting samples to really understand what's going on. And really to make things credible, especially for transboundary negotiations, you need two countries to agree to collecting that data at different points in a river's sort of life cycle as well. So the key is really improving trust with civil society and then amongst countries as well. And data and transparency is going to be really key to that.
Thank you for joining me, Natasha and Will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.